Good morning. My name is Jean Schensul. I'm the founding director and senior scientist at the Institute for Community Research, working in partnership with the Yale CIRA and also with the READS program, for which I am one of two principal investigators at the moment. This is the presentation that is being prepared for READS scholars, but it can be useful for many other purposes. The introduction will review a variety of aspects of qualitative research, including ethnography, and will be done in two parts. The first part focuses on an introduction to qualitative research and research design, and the second part focuses on tools and methods and some, to a very limited extent, some ideas about preparing their situation, cultural rules, the rationales behind their behavior, and such things. We do in qualitative research, so as probably all of you know, qualitative research is iterative, it's ongoing. Another term for this is abductive, where we're generating an idea, acting or investigating in the environment, testing the idea, and little by little building up a larger picture of what's going on. In qualitative research, we usually use text or visually based data, although we use many other forms of data as well. Our data are derived from observations, from interviews, from a number of different elicitation techniques, and the collection of various types of records, material objects, cultural artifacts, photographs, and so on. Anything that helps us to tell the story of what is going on in the life of a person, a setting, an institution, and so on. In qualitative research, the focus of the study is usually localized, although that's not so much the case now, as there's quite a lot of qualitative research is being conducted on the internet, which means that oftentimes it's global in scope, and the boundaries really can't be, or it's difficult at least to define the boundaries geographically. So localized used to refer to the conduct of ethnography or even qualitative interviews in a particular site. So that is no longer the case. The unit of the study can be at multiple levels. In qualitative research, we can focus on individuals as the unit of study and analysis. We can focus on particular points in history. We can look at larger organizational units, departments of hospitals, social networks, whole communities, however they're defined, cities, and so on. But we do usually define the unit of study and we bound it. We usually try to use small samples, although qualitative research can include a quantitative component, which I usually term the ethnographic interview. And there we would want larger samples so that we could look statistically at variation within. Qualitative research emphasizes validity and over generalizability. And we often use either case study or continuous assessment designs, particularly in interventions, but not always only in interventions. So when do we do qualitative research? When do we use ethnographic research, and when do we use case study approaches? You can see the variety of ways in which and reasons for using qualitative research in this slide. So I won't go over all of the points. I'll just say that we generally use qualitative or ethnographic research in the formative stage of a study when a problem isn't really clear. We want to understand exactly what's going on. A good example, for example, is feeling of sadness or loss among older adults in senior housing. So we don't really, when we first hear about that problem, we think it might be depression, but we don't really know what it is, and so we need to ask people. And then once we determine that we really are talking about with them something that looks like depression, we can figure out how to measure it more effectively. It's useful when we don't know why something happens or why it happens at the time that it does. Or if, for example, we have a study model and we have a domain that we don't understand very well, or it's a new idea, particularly one that has come up in discussion with a group of partners. So I'll give you an example. For example, the quality of mother-daughter communication. This is an idea that came up quite a long time ago and was raised by mothers in a community organization who wanted to see better communication between mothers and daughters. It was at a time when we didn't have any literature on communication between mothers and daughters, and so we spent quite a while talking about what that concept actually meant, what quality communication was with the mothers and then with the daughters themselves, and then we're more effectively able to measure it. Also, there are times when entering a community, for example, or working with a group of people who maybe don't like researchers very much. They've had negative experiences in the past with researchers. And they also, as with some students, for example, high school students don't really trust surveys. They think that students don't tell the truth on surveys. So qualitative research can be a very good way of starting out, both to build trust and to sort of get a better understanding of the concepts that might be introduced in a survey. Qualitative research is also very important when we need new approaches to intervention that are not available in the literature. For example, if we're working with a new population, if we want to do an intervention on a health topic that's never been done before, we can borrow, but we also need to find out from the people we're working with and for whom the intervention is intended, whether it makes sense to them, what the content might be that would help them most effectively, and so on. It's also useful to do qualitative research when we see that there are relationships, associations in our survey data that we can't really explain, that are unexpected. And so we want to go back to the study population and ask them why they think there's an association and what it might mean. And there also are times when people want their story told. For example, when British Petroleum, the accident occurred, the disaster occurred in the Gulf area, there were many people whose stories weren't told, and a number of researchers, including anthropologists, who reached local communities and engaged with them to talk about the consequences that were not identified by the press. So their stories were told and recorded in photo voice documentation, which had a significant effect on lawsuits. So we also finally, there are many behaviors that are hidden, private, or undiscovered. So in the early years of HIV research with people who were injecting drugs, the respondents in surveys or even in interviews were describing how they did it, but it was only observation by a number of researchers who were willing to enter the field to be with them and to watch what was going on, that they actually saw how risk was being transmitted. So those are all good reasons to consider I'm sure there are many more, but to consider making a decision about doing qualitative or ethnographic research. Mixed methods is a term that refers to integrating or combining in different ways qualitative and quantitative research. By quantitative, I'm referring to survey research, epidemiologic survey research. By qualitative, I'm referring to the exploration of meaning and cultural patterns and so on. So the sort of the origins of each of these approaches is somewhat different, but they can be combined in multiple ways, sequentially, simultaneously. Qualitative can follow quantitative. Qualitative research can intermittently enter into dialogue with with quantitative research in a longitudinal study or in a clinical trial. So there are many ways that data can come together. I have to say, in my opinion, it's not rocket science. You make decisions, as we all do in science, about what we would like to know, how we would like to learn it, and if it makes sense to intersperse mixed methods, then we should. But there's no mandate to do it. It doesn't always make the research better. We have to have good reasons for doing it. And ultimately, we have to triangulate our data to see how one form of data interfaces with another to either confirm or disconfirm the results of our research. Ethnography is a kind of a slightly different animal. Ethnography, unlike many types of qualitative research, is not conducted usually in an office setting. Ethnography engages in the study settings with the people who are functioning in their normal everyday lives, whether it's in a school, an office, a playground, the broader community, parts of a community. They're doing what they usually do, and the researcher tries as much as possible to engage in the situation, come to know people in the situation or the setting, and then eventually introduce various forms of data collection that are comfortable in that setting. Ethnography is face-to-face. Sometimes it's formal, sometimes it's informal. It's always rigorous because observations and encounters in a field setting, even when they're informal, are recorded systematically. It's science in the sense of rigorous recording, and researchers are required to identify who they are and why they're in that informal setting using scripts that are reviewed and standardized, usually by IRBs. Ethnography, like a lot of qualitative research, really tries to understand situations through the eyes of the participants. And that does mean trying to understand lifestyles as well as learning through reporting or interviews or discussions. So the context is very important to ethnography. Qualitative research or qualitative methodology is always in context. So here's a standard ecological model. It can look different depending on what the concentric circles are, but usually following Bronfenbrenner and so many other people, Trickett and so on. We talk about individuals, peers, families, social networks, institutions, larger communities. There's always a policy, a media level, and so on. So different people organize this target in different ways. It doesn't really matter as long as we recognize that there are sort of multiple spheres of influence on an individual, and in turn they interact with each other. So from a qualitative perspective and also an ethnographic perspective, context always includes culture. So what do we mean by context and culture? In our READS program, for example, we are emphasizing the importance of community-based research, which generally means having some engagement in a community setting. We want to understand the multiple levels of influence on an individual's behavior and vice versa. And we want and need a clearer understanding of what the elements of context are and what the elements of culture are. And culture, by culture, I'm subsuming social behaviors and the meanings attributed to them. So context, oftentimes, this is not an exclusive list, but oftentimes it refers to events that take place in let's say, a community or an institutional setting that have an effect on what happens in that setting. The people in the setting and the organization of people in the setting, who may or may not be the target of our study, but at least have some influence on those individuals. The places and the built environment in which events occur and people interact. History is very important because history, both distant and current history, can shape present circumstances. social and political structures which generate policies, both direct and indirect, that have an effect on people's lives and the environment in which they live, and the rules and regulatory actions, all of which have to do with power over the options that people have in a setting. So culture generally refers to the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral rules that guide, these rules are implicit and explicit, that guide practice in a particular place and time. So we talk about beliefs, attitudes, intentions, social and behavioral norms, values, rituals, and routines. Rituals are kind of bigger events like birthday parties and weddings and so on. Routines are the daily routines that people engage in their lives, going to work, getting their car fixed, mowing the lawn, and so on. And the rules for those behaviors, because there always are sort of general rules that people are socialized into understanding, and scripts for behaviors, the meanings associated with the behaviors and the guidelines for interaction, and then the behaviors themselves. So just a couple of comments about culture, which is generally sort of not very clearly defined, although there's a great deal of literature that tries to do it. Some principles. So culture applies to more than one. We don't usually talk about the culture of an individual, although we can talk about individual sort of engagement with cultural rules and practices. Culture is generated by two or more people, and it is engaged in by two or more people. So if we find one, I always say that if we find a person doing something interesting, we don't call it a trend unless three people are doing the same thing, and then we start looking for more and we find a cultural pattern. But it's always important to find variation within a cultural pattern, and I'll come back to that. So cultural rules can be found and they can be described. Finding them may involve participation in them and asking about them, learning them, or it may be understood by interviewing people about them. They're not always conscious. Cultural rules and patterns are not universal. That is, they don't apply to everybody in a group, and there's a whole field of research, consensus analysis, that looks at the degree to which people agree with or disagree with or are close to or distant from generalized cultural patterns. So if there are a large number of people who are congruent with a set of meanings, then we say that they're situated in the cultural core, but there is variation around that core which may have meaning as people may be disagreeing with it, practicing other options, belong to a different group, and so on. So variability is important in understanding a population, whatever that is, whether it's individuals, institutions, schools, etc. I've already mentioned that new practices and beliefs are constructed in interaction. So that is to say that it opens the door to the idea that individuals and organizations have agency and can plan. Once people understand what the cultural rules are, they can decide if they like them, if they want to change them, modify them, adapt them, plan, reframe them, and revise cultural rules, beliefs, and practices. And that constitutes, within the constraints of, let's say, regulatory actions and political history and so on, how people generate new cultural options. So culture and context are complex, they vary, and they interact with each other, and the challenge is to try to understand how they do. Now let's go to research design and talk about the options in qualitative research designs. So again, I'm coming back to qualitative, not ethnographic. Qualitative is a subset within ethnographic. So qualitative research, no matter what, is always comparative, as is all research. We're always interested in differences and similarities within and across cases. So we can do individual case studies, we do autoethnography, we do long narratives and life course histories and so on, but they're always illustrative of larger patterns. So in order to do better research, we need comparison. Qualitative research usually has small sample sizes. If we intersperse it with surveys, our sample sizes may be larger, but the larger the sample size in qualitative research, the more costly and challenging it is to get a handle on what the data are saying to us, because there are more interviews, for example, to transcribe, more interviews to code, more codes, and so on. So it becomes difficult or challenging. So qualitative research can include one or several approaches to data collection, and also oftentimes considers multiple levels of data collection. For example, at the policy level, at the cultural level, or social structural level, at the individual level, and at the group level. Qualitative research can be longitudinal, and there are several publications that describe how to do. It's not like most research. Qualitative research is cross-sectional. That is, it takes place at one point in time, but because there may be long-term embeddedness in a community setting, that one point in time can be extended, and then in some interesting ways, it becomes longitudinal research in which we're trying to examine what trends are occurring over time and why they're occurring. It can be inductive, deductive, or both. Usually it's both, and I don't myself particularly like purely inductive research, but some people do like to start with, quote, a blank slate, and induce codes associated with their data without having a research model or a set of initial codes. I don't particularly endorse that approach. Qualitative research designs can be mixed methods designs as well. So here are just some examples of ethnographic or qualitative research questions. And when you think ethnographic, think being in the field, face-to-face, experiential, along with other sources of data collection. When you think qualitative, qualitative research doesn't necessarily require being in the field, but it does require some face-to-face or usually face-to-face, although if it's internet qualitative research, it's coding of secondary data. So one type of question is based on this year's Reed Scholars, why do MSM and San Juan go to multiple religious locations? Well, first of all, we're making the assumption that they do, but we don't really know that. So in order to know that, we might like to go to different religious locations that represent different religious traditions, see who's going, and try to get a sense from those settings or from men who talk about those settings, what is happening in those settings, and then talk to men about why they go. But all of that is in the initial stage of the research and really requires some qualitative inquiry because we don't really know enough to introduce a survey that is going to grasp the issues that we're concerned about at the beginning. A second issue might be, what do African American fathers talk about with their sons, and when and where and why? So this question arises in the context of discussing sensitive issues around sexual risk, but it could revolve around substance abuse, or it could revolve around relationships, or around family issues. It doesn't really matter what the topic is, but the general question is, what do they talk about? Because we want to try to understand, if our study is about sexual risk, sort of the general context in which they talk with their sons, if they talk with their sons, how they talk with their sons, what they like to talk about with their sons, and why, and so on. So let me move on to talk about levels of data collection.